and I believe that the project today is somewhat tangential, so we can have lots of rich discussion in the Q&A. So Nick's talk this evening is entitled Manufacturing Childhood in Hong Kong, Literature in the Kingdom of Plastic Toys. And Nick, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that introduction, and thank you, Gina, for inviting me to speak. I'll just share my screen right now. Great, so I have a couple of plastic toys behind me. But on the screen, I've showed you a photo of the giant inflatable duck that visited Victoria Harbour in May 2013. And you will remember that it deflated quite soon after. But this duck was based on the design of the Russian-American sculptor that was, the design was patented in the US in 1949, but very few people remember the history that a year before that, there was another person by the name of L.T. Lam in Hong Kong, a plastics tycoon manufacturer who made what was called the lemon tea duck, which was also Hong Kong's first plastic toy in 1948. So this is just some kind of background to the global circulations of a figure of a plastic toy duck for you. So as Beth mentioned, my research and book project is on resource extraction and its relationship to decolonial literary intellectual formations in Southeast Asia using Chinese language writings. But today I'd like to develop my talk into an article. I'll share some of my initial ideas on this. And the talk is structured in a way that I'll introduce Hong Kong industries in general and then move on to talk about toy manufacturing and then literature. The main thing I hope to do today is to think about the relationship between materialism and space, or what I'll call mise-en-scène. Mise-en-scène in the jargon means stage design or scene arrangement. But today I'll invite you to sort of pay attention to how an exhibit or a photo or a literary scene is staged as I go through my presentation. So first, I'll present two critiques of materialism. That is how post-war Hong Kong benefited from the deliberate reorganization of industrial spaces by several nations. And rather than think of Hong Kong as a success story that was miraculous and unique because of its thriving industries, and that sort of fed into its stereotypical self-image of Hong Kong's transformation from a fishing village to a metropolis. But today I want to present toys as an alternative image of the lack of democratic reform in Hong Kong, firstly, because of its in-between space as a colony and transition to a nation, caught between the geopolitical forces of Beijing and London. And secondly, Hong Kong industry's important role within the story of post-war imperialism and anti-communism. And later I'll end with literature as it gives us insight into how writers approach toys and objects, and questions of self-mastery and freedom from and through the material. This is what you saw just now was the tin mining activities, and this is a rubber plantation in colonial Malaya. So 2 days ago, when I was walking under the tunnel in Chatham Road in Tsim Sha Tsui, TST, like Baudelaire's flaneur, strolling around the bowels of Kowloon, observing society, I ran into this poster on the left, which is a figure of a robot just trampling over the Hong Kong cityscape. And the words are made in Hong Kong, the typical label, then and now. And of course, when we think about made in Hong Kong, the irony or tragedy is, of course, a changing situation now that the Hong Kong brand is under question after the US ended its preferential treatment for the city under the Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992. And you need to switch the label to made in China. But obviously, a lot of manufacturers are going around that by sort of adding in small print underneath that it was their product was indeed made in Hong Kong. So this sense of self-confidence and projection of their product, what wonderful products that they present is also in the action comedy on the right, Aces Go Places, made in 1983. This was a global co-production of a movie that plays on Hong Kong's reputation of its famous toy industry. It's a satire of James Bond. It features a transformer type product on the left, which is the black robot toy. This was a Hong Kong office hit, and they transformed this plastic toy and made it into an action figure for kids to play. So as you see, they were confident enough to parody James Bond and what we think of as zany Hong Kong comedy action film. I think someone's talking in the background. So I mentioned walking along Chatham Road and in TST East, and this was what it looked like I think several decades ago. So what you see here in front of you is an aerial view of the Chinese Manufacturers Association annual exhibition in 1969. And they featured all sorts of products at this trade fair. And obviously it was organized by the Federation of Hong Kong Industries, founded in 1960, which is one of the big 8 chambers of commerce in Hong Kong. So you see, I'll show you photos of the kinds of things that they displayed. But I'd like to pause and sort of talk about the standard narrative of what was the rise and decline of Hong Kong's industries over the last few decades. So the typical narrative is that during World War II, Shanghai industrialists and laborers fled to Hong Kong from the mainland. They brought with them capital, labor, and knowledge, and ushered in the golden age of Hong Kong industries. And until 1980s, when Hong Kong shifted to high-tech and financial sectors, there was a shift from industries to real estate. But in the intervening time, generations of children grew up in the 1970s and 80s with made in Hong Kong toys, not just in Hong Kong, but everywhere around the world. They played with figures from Star Wars to G.I. Joe action figures, to Rubik's Cubes and water pistols. And in early 1980s onwards, the manufacturing base shifted to the neighboring Guangdong province in mainland China because of its cheap labor. But many people have challenged this standard narrative. And one of the ways is when you look at slide 1, I presented LT Lam. When he fled to Hong Kong, he also went back to China during the war to set up a factory on the mainland before the factory was sort of confiscated and nationalized in 1953, and he came back to Hong Kong. So there's not one way in which people migrate to Hong Kong and are based here, but there are lots of regional interactions, as well as ways in which the products, design, and innovation travel. But I think for the purposes of Hong Kong memory, as you can see on Hong Kong Memory website, they remember this rise and decline of the toy industry as with a melancholic sense of something that has been vanishing, the closure, for example, of the cotton mills. If you go to Tsuen Wan, there is the mills, which is a very great art space. It used to be a cotton mills factory, but right now, I think just last year or this year, it reopened as a business, what they call a business incubator, an experiential retail, and a nonprofit cultural institution. So I'll talk a little bit about how plastic toys came into effect. Before plastic toys, there was the plastic industry that sort of tailored to other basic products, such as plastic cups, pacifiers, toothbrushes, combs, photo frames, mahjong pieces. And they diversified their products and later started shifting to making plastic toys and flowers in the early 1960s. And in 1965, plastic toys took over and became the dominant product, and hence the title of my talk, Hong Kong as the Kingdom of Plastic Toys. And once materials shifted, there was, first we started with a tin cast way of manufacturing and shifted into the injection plastic mold, and later you have other kinds of products that were better than plastic, and then the toy manufacturers also started using other materials too. But I'll use plastic industries or plastic toys as a general term to refer to this phenomenon of the cultural industry in Hong Kong. So I listed a couple of items that have been manufactured in Hong Kong: waxwork wigs, dolls, artificial flowers, jewelry, shoes, toys, watches, electrical goods. And all of them sort of have their symbolic potential to explain a part of Hong Kong, right? Watches, you could say, is, it fits into the fast, gritty city of Hong Kong. There's no time left on your watch, but I feel like such allegorical reading is insufficient to capture the dynamic city and the contradictions that Hong Kong embodies, right? And so on the right, you see a perplexing depiction of how, I guess, Hong Kongers grasp modernity, right? You have a rickshaw coolie driver pulling what is a wax figure of the Mona Lisa. I don't know how beautiful you think it is, but there's a slope to convey some kind of verisimilitude. I think the curtain at the back, but this is a typical scene you would see at like a wax museum that glorifies or celebrates the industries here. And on the left, you see a woman piecing together a wig. And what I like to mention is that there was a lot of horizontal movement between industries because some of the processes of like plastic injection molding can be transferred to another kind of industry. So last weekend I was at Asia Art Archive and I was poking around and I found this book edited by Matthew Turner and Irene Nan. It's published in the 1990s, looking back at Hong Kong's 60s design identity. And so on the right, you see cute photos of children at the fair looking at the newfangled toys that they probably are not able to afford, but they would encounter at these large exhibitions, right? So you see export items, mostly utilitarian, from thermoflasks, from underwear, plastic buckets to toys that could not be purchased anywhere else. Yet, I quote what Matthew Turner writes, yet the real attraction to Hong Kong's working population lay in admiring and buying the very products they themselves had made in the factories. So this is kind of a closed loop, except, what happens in the middle is a little bit suspended, right? So there's an identity suspended between the fantasy of export promotion and the grim experience of factory life, neither colonial nor nationalistic, yet predominantly Cantonese. So when the editors Matthew Turner and Irene Ngan, along with the exhibition curator Oscar Ho Hing-Kei, curated this exhibition in the 1990s that looked back at the 60s, they sort of argued that the rise of Hong Kong's specific modern identity is maybe coinciding with the rise of Hong Kong's design industry. But then in one essay, Matthew Turner sort of problematizes this notion of a Hong Kong identity, right? Because of the floating population of Hong Kong, where do we center the idea of identity? Is it through culture? Is it through politics or literature? And he has quite a stinging criticism of Hong Kong industries, in particular of the false consciousness of chasing after material good or economic stability and using that as an excuse for the lack of political and social reforms in the city. And this was agreed upon by Beijing and London. So I'll just read to you what I have on the screen. How does toys relate to the idea of governance? So he says, China has also demonstrated a keen appreciation for models of patrician leadership exercised in Hong Kong during the 60s. The appointment of senior Hong Kong figures of that generation, such as S.Y. Chung, T.K.N., as high-profile advisors recalls an earlier era when the same figures led the Federation of Industries and propounded its depoliticized rhetoric of progress. Later on, he says, the problem of self-image in a territory that will shortly cease to exist in its present form of British subjects without nationality, the compatriots of a China from which most have chosen to leave, seems to bring us back to earlier images of a dislocated, alienated society, a population of residents and other persons without a unique identity to protect, merely a capitalistic way of life to maintain. And this is crucial, what comes after. Such an image is a convenient expedient used to justify the political decision of Britain and China not to allow the Hong Kong people to speak for themselves. So there was, on the one hand, the impossibility to create a Hong Kong identity for a diverse set of people, but he argues for its necessity. However, the development of Hong Kong identity was constantly suppressed by authorities. A consensus between Beijing, London, and Hong Kong residents, or Hong Kong residents, in what they call a three-legged stool. You know, when a three-legged stool is propped on the floor, it forms a very stable base for sitting on it, right? So their industry leaders and technocratic governance was sort of in cahoots with interventionist colonial rule in Hong Kong under the facade of laissez-faire. And so toys play a kind of a substitutional role to political reform in this version of the story, right? Right, so next we move on to two published official accounts of the toy industry in Hong Kong. On the right is a poster of an exhibit at the Hong Kong Museum of History, the Legend of Hong Kong Toys, it says. And on the left is published by the Commercial Press, the complete book, Hong Kong Toys Handbook. I own these two books and I really enjoy the narrative that they present. But to summarize, they, looking back, when you present a kind of retrospective of the rise and decline of an industry, it's usually a narrative of a self-made industrious spirit, how they choose to museumize an identity and present their past achievement and look forward to the future. And I really like how the plastic toy dog is being reappropriated and presented as probably Hong Kong Island or something on the background. Right, so the second argument I like to make about toys is that it's a keynote in the concept of global capitalism. So we know around the world, the German tin toy industry was very famous in the 30s, but it was quickly superseded by Japanese companies, and then Hong Kong in the 60s, and then in the 80s, mainland China. And so there's this model of the Asian manufacturing working with US and European market and distributors, although there was also sometimes exchange of ideas and patents where Hong Kong would actually design their own cars. So there was this repetition in what we call capitalist accumulation, where there's an outsourcing of cheap labor and innovation. When sometimes you get into arguments where German or UK toy makers would accuse Japanese or Hong Kong toy makers of producing cheap quality products which were imitating other people's products, but then they obviously argued against that, right? And so the second picture on the slide is from a journal called Chuang. I think they're based in Glasgow, a communist journal who really talks about the post-war industrial capitalism in a very stinging critique way. When they talk about Hong Kong's place within post-war imperialism in East Asia, there's a form of communism that's anti-communism that's attached to capitalism here. But I won't go into detail about the arguments. You can read them online. I highly recommend it. And I was also struck that the Mekong Review recently had a couple of review essays about plastics, books about plastics, and Robert Templer, who was reviewing those books, talked about the Hong Kong toy industry. And in his words, he mentioned the Hong Kong property tycoon Li Ka-shing, who sort of owned Cheung Kong Group factories, and the factories produced G.I. Joes, which was a toy that was played around the world at the height of the war in Vietnam, right? The American war in Vietnam. And so Li Ka-shing built his first fortune on injection molded plastic. And so G.I. Joes, for this reviewer, weaves together the threads of Asian development across over the past 50 years, the economic boost from the Vietnam War, which shaped the economies of the emerging Asian tigers, the emergence of a new tycoon class that would soon dominate businesses across the region, forming vast conglomerates and making even bigger personal fortunes. And plastic is, because it was born, it was the driver of growth in many economies. In the next slide, I'll like to sort of shift gears, and as a preview of what I'll talk about later is, can we think of Utopia as a toy shop? So in Matthew Turner's edited volume on Hong Kong design in the 60s, there was this contributor who wrote an essay, Is a Hong Kong Identity Too Utopian to Think About? And the gist of the argument is that it's hard to talk about a Hong Kong identity. It's sort of utopian rather than realistic. It's bound to fail before it even starts to take root. And also the fact that people have to have living standards to go up before, thinking about culture, because culture is, for the leisurely class, so to speak. And so on the right, I sort of attached an interview done by Cici, or I'll pronounce her name in Cantonese, which is Sai Sai. In one of the magazines, Fleur de Lettres, Zihua, she talked about a toy shop being like a utopia being like a toy shop. So the Chinese is on the right, but I'll read my English translation. So she responds to the question, if you could open a toy shop, how would it be different from other toy shops? What sort of place would it be? The response is, a friend described Tao Yuanming's Peach Blossom Spring as a toy shop that the poet had opened, unaware that the world outside is actually protesting against the world outside. Over there, in a place such as Utopia, if you're not a celestial being, then you still need to work hard as a farmer. So haven't I already opened such a shop using my writing, which contains material objects that I've painstakingly created, as in my book, My Georgia. So Georgia refers to the miniature Georgian houses that Cici Sai Sai collects. She ends by saying, I welcome friends to this shop. So here, Sai Sai has a toy-mediated way of thinking about art, literature, and life that I'll discuss later. And just to say a little bit about Sai Sai's background, she needs to eat in order to keep doing her writing. But she was from a refugee family from Shanghai, and came to Hong Kong quite early on, became a high school teacher. When she retired, she focused a lot of her energies on writing novels, short pieces, ekphrastic pieces about toys, and things that she handmade and crafted by hand. And so on the left, this could be, Sai Sai's utopia, right? I mean, factory workers sort of producing art/products, but also writing later on. On the right is a photo of, I'm not sure if it's a toy shop in Wanzhai or Samsui-Po, but there are toy shops. There's a toy street on both sides of the harbor. But walking around, it sort of arouses a different reaction probably from looking at the poster that I saw at the beginning of the slides, right? The Made in Hong Kong label, which is quite anxiety provoking, perhaps. But this is sort of in your face. You have the beginning of the labor and the products that are generated, and then the selling and distribution at the shop. So I didn't include a photo, but in the 60s and 70s, the factory women, they found new economic freedom from having a job, but they were also looking at other models of free liberated women, and one of them was Chan Boji, and her movies about factory women, about the kind of transformation that they can have economically, and also being able to love and become a movie star. Right? Just on this thread on labor and industry, we cannot forget plastic flowers, which is how Li Ka-shing sort of got his start before he moved into property and ports. I'll mention this because when we think about toys children, we should not neglect that there were child laborers helping their moms at home, stitching together plastic flowers. And just to give you a sense of how the notion of plastic flowers is so extensive, in Liu Yichang's novel, The Drunkard, he even begins with a scene where he references he compares the dream of the Red Chamber to the plastic toy, plastic flowers manufacturing in Hong Kong. So I quote, "I dream of Lin Daiyu making plastic flowers in a factory. I dream of Hong Kong sinking into the sea. I dream of her dreaming my dream and dreaming of me." So there's the kind of overlay of a tedium in industrial society together with a classical Chinese fantasy about love and desire that's sort of rubs against each other and produces a disorienting effect. Right, I love these photos that I'm showing you right now. So this is also from Matthew Turner and Irene Ngan's book. So what happens when the toys that you buy on the street make it into the home? And these are sort of fantasies that I think colonial Hong Kong wants to project. You know, there are a lot of documentary films being made of the happy family, what is a domestic life with a family unit, and you often see toys featured as a central trope in the middle of the room that the child is playing with. The toys in central display as an object that brings together notions of childhood, empire, gender, labor, and the family unit. And this is not just child's play because you need adults to buy the toys for the family, right? But I sort of wonder about the media specificity of this argument, right? Toys being such a central idea of domesticity and what is a stable, what people call bourgeois life. How is that being depicted in literature? You know, when we talk about objects in literature, the concepts of imitation and representation get transformed. You know, we think of literature also as a plaything and a commodity, whereas the movie does not necessarily see toys in such a way. And so to make that argument, I'd like to start with Handmade Toys. The one on the right is from Tong Le Yuan, which is the children's paradise. You see two goldfish on top of each other, but excuse me for that. So on the right, you see, you can make toys out of paper and ready-mades around the house, and you don't actually have to go to the market or like the supermarket to buy your toys. And so children who cannot afford to buy toys are able to make their own. And so I think sci-fi sort of grew up, reading these magazines, and that inculcated a sense of craftiness and creation. Concepts of play and labor sort of emerged from the toys era of the 60s. Right on the left, there's a cut of a newspaper. I didn't translate it, but it's basically descriptions of the types of handmade toys that children who grew up then played with. Right. So there is a movie that I would highly recommend you watch, I guess. So there was a previous screening last Sunday, but it will be in the theaters this Thursday. And one of the shorts in this movie, one of the shorts in the four shorts is one about toys. The movie is called Memories to Choke On, Drinks to Wash Them Down. I won't go into a close analysis of this, but the toy section is part of four films that talk about Hong Kong identity and memory. And it talks about the failed promises of democratic reform, about immigration, about helicopter teachers who come in to teach English but then leave. And so it sort of combines a critique that I mentioned earlier just now about the structure of Hong Kong's industrial capitalism, right? And I won't go into detail, but there are a lot of really nice toys being featured in this. There's a Bruce Lee figurine. There's a pink Power Rangers toy that gets moved around. There's the Initial D car and what's called a Hina doll, I think. And so it talks about the memory of a struggle to keep the toy shop alive. And so Here, I like to pause for a second and think about materialism and spaces, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, right? Mise-en-scène, you see a lot of toys scattered in this toy shop and how each of them is a repository for a memory filled dash dreams, or toys as a kind of insidious materialistic image of anti-democracy or capital accumulation. But I think for writers who are able to collect and make their own toys, toys have a different function. And when they write about them, it's quite apparent. So here I'll move on to show you some literary texts and literary theory around the anxiety of figuring out what the child means in modern Chinese literature. So modern Chinese literary history arguably discovered the child in the early 20th century through writers like Zhou Zhuoren or Lu Xun, who advocated for children's rights. They argued that they should respect and know the child on their own terms and not treat a child as an immature, stunted, undeveloped adult. So toys are allowed, and basically children get to play them and engage in fanciful flights of the imagination. And in playing with toys, they develop their self-confidence. But then there's this tension within the theory of modern Chinese children's literature, because the child needs to grow up and be taught correct ways in line with projects of national sovereignty, rehabilitation, and resistance against semi-colonialism and imperialism. So in the first half of the 20th century, a lot of this literature sort of shuttled between we should respect the child's autonomy, but also we should also make the child into a project of national assimilation, national defense, right? And so I sort of categorize, I think, Hong Kong literature as following this general trend, even though it's a kind of diasporic move away from modern Chinese literature, right? So even though they sort of take into account, for example, John Dewey, who's an American philosopher, his influence on Chinese conceptions of children literature, how autonomy and play is important. I think for these books, it's important to see the shock of diaspora during the war and sort of using Hong Kong to register maybe certain threats of Chinese civilization and culture that are, under erasure in the mainland, or to think about locality and transformations in the diasporic society. But I guess I'm sort of irritated with notions of, if you want really respect the child's autonomy, why do you still want to talk about national development, right? I'm not saying these authors do that, but I think there's a general trope in modern Chinese literature where the child is being perceived of in this way. So the person I like to counterpose this trend is Walter Benjamin, who is a German aesthetic theorist. In particular, his early writings on Russian and German toys in the 1920s. And you can view this body of literature together with his radio plays and letters, which is quite different from his later essays on reproducibility of media, etc. But in this archive of his earlier diaries and scribblings and notes that he records on the trains, Benjamin's materialism should be viewed in the context of his support for liberal democracy in Germany during the 1920s. And so I really liked his focus on children and toys in this passage, and I copied it wholesale, so I'll read it out to you. Benjamin described this scene in his notebook. It illustrates for him essential aspects of infantile activity. Stefan presents a performance that follows the example of his absent father. He identifies with him, acts in front of Grete as the adult who has to do something. He becomes the absent father who must work and may not be disturbed. Standing still in the darkness, Stefan plays at intellectual work, right? And in fact, the game represents this work following a dark necessity. For Stefan has indeed to work something through. He was compelled by his father to renounce, and that is what the work that he now does affords. Passive concernment is reversed in an assertion of independence. Climbing the staircase, Stefan ascends to adulthood. So this is a metaphorical image, right? Figures himself now as the father. And conversely, Rete, who follows him, appears in the position of the child. Benjamin wrote about infantile play and its relationship to work in various texts. These contain considerations that demonstrate in particular how the everyday life of the family, their interactions in the domestic setting, the play of the child, the son, all played a role in his thought. And so I think for Benjamin, he sort of respects the autonomy of the child, but there's no sense of tying it to the construction of nationhood or territoriality. In fact, it's the reverse, right? For Benjamin, it's about the imaginative play that constitutes the child's growth and subjectivity. And so how does everything I've told you concern Hong Kong literature? I mean, we have Sai, right? And I really want to use Sai as a figure to anchor my argument about toys, industrial capitalism, but also kind of material freedom that you can grasp from that. And the concept of the toy shop is interesting. So in the interview that I mentioned, Sai also has a fantastic one-liners, right? She says, "Isn't it Utopia a non-existent impossible toy?" And she references the great Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is the greatest player in the sense that, you know, the way he stitches together different arguments for his ontological relativism, right? So you see how he does that and shows that humans are not the only way of defining other living beings. And so there's a kind of mutual recognition of the small role that humans play among other living beings, both in the works of Sai and Zhuangzi. And then the interview went on to ask, toys with no life can in fact define humans. For example, reflect that humans like to play games and are animals that play. If toys are mirrors, what kind of self will humans reflect in this mirror? And Sai's response is, we are what we play, basically. There are active and passive games, and people who play on their phones and the computer, people who play politics, and people who play nuclear weapons. But I think Sai is interested in none of that. She's interested in making her own teddy bears and toys and writing about them in ways that defy genre and also what people view as literary value and productivity. So there's a kind of writing against the instrumentalization and compartmentalization of human relations in industry by setting up connections, right? And so these are my last few slides, focusing on Sai. You've probably seen a lot of posters about One City, One Book, Hong Kong everywhere, right? So the book they're promoting is Sai's My City, that's translated by renditions. And so I found a section in the book about toys and literature, and I'll read it up to you, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about it. Next to the florist is a toy shop. On this day, besides the usual teddy bears, string puppets, Lego, and complex jigsaw puzzles, there are two best-selling toys on display. One is a rubbish bug complete with 4 toes and a body full of spots. The other is a white blur of a ghost. The toy shop holds an annual monster competition. The result this year has been computed and is now written on the board. Liberty remembers what was written on the board last year. You don't play mahjong, you are a monster. Liberty recalls that there were similar words on the board the year before that. You don't beat the animal press, you are a monster. Now Liberty sees these words on the board. You compose modern poetry, you are a monster. Right, so I think this is also an indirect critique of people who say that Sai doesn't write literature, or when she writes modern poetry, it just doesn't follow certain conventional understandings of modern innovation, right? But to the contrary, I see sort of the idea of toys and the toy shop sort of informing Sai's modernism. You know, when you play a piece of Lego, a stacked piece of Lego together, there's a kind of modular structure that gets emulated across her works. And Sai is known for writing about very everyday, sort of mundane objects and topics, but the way she sort of challenges genre and transform them is quite amazing, right? So these are some of the books that deal with toys. It's not all of them, but on the left is a book called My Toys, and Sai the nice bow hat, and the Teddy Bear Chronicles, which was just released by CUHK Press this year, and my Georgia, I guess the Georgian houses that I was talking about, and some jigsaw puzzles, and you can see some of Sai's creations and the hand-stitched teddy bears. And it's worth mentioning that Sai apprenticed as a sort of a toy maker and a teddy bear maker. And she mentioned that she's initially not so great, but then she was able to produce such wonders. So yeah, I won't talk about this. Recently there was an article published about a toy workshop in Kuntong, Li Toy. They celebrate the Made in Hong Kong label and are designing for the new generation. So the difference that between Sai's teddy bears and the toys these people make is that Sai collects and makes unique toys and teddy bears for her private collection, but shares them with readers through photographs in her literary books. But the co-founders of Le Toy, Lewa and Lego, designs unique quote-unquote products that can be bought and sold. And so this, I think this is the trend of how toys are being distributed and developed in Hong Kong. It's sort of it's evolved from a manufacturing sort of factory line production into sort of a workshop craftsmanship objects. Right? I'd like to end with this slide, this provocative slide about thinking about toys, children, gender, and sex work, because I mean, we haven't really talked about gender, even though we talked about gender in the family previously, but you know, Hong Kong being a space where you can procure sex work, but also buy sex toys at the same time. And so there's this short story collection by Dorothy Tse called Eagle-Headed Cat and the Music Box Girl, has a section about a professor and how he has a love affair with Alice, the music box ballerina, in his college office, and it involves a wooden horse too. So I'll just read selected passages, right? So there's like attention to detail for the cranking of the metal spring from the music box, and like this, her breasts were peeped out from the cleavage of a suit like an Alice with all the modern feels, and again, dance with the difficult classical ballet routine for the Professor Q. And then the shocking imagery of how suddenly there's a wooden horse, you know, that enters. One day, Professor Q didn't know how he had retrieved a haughty-looking wooden horse who was snow white from head to toe and sported golden yellow fur. The wooden horse had a curved base which rocked back and forth and made it run at the hint of a touch. Of course, on the horse's back was Professor Q and Alice's already naked bodies. The professor, clutching onto Alice, thought of himself as a prince in a fairy tale. Not like those purified fairy tales in the modern world, but as in the folk tales filled with desire and lust. And so I guess Dorothy brings together the sex, gender, and the toy within the image of plastic sex toys, right? Or the wooden horse. When we think about you know, cheap local labor of the childlike Hong Kong girl that is exploited for customers, we often no longer think about Hong Kong as this sleazy border town designing risque novelties and sex toys, but I just like to insert it in there. Maybe it won't have any use for my essay in the end, but I'll just end on this very bizarre, strange note, and I'll welcome your comments and any questions you might have for me. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Nick. That was absolutely fascinating and very fills you with nostalgia as, you know, somewhat adult now to think about our own childhood and the role of toys in it. So do we have any questions at the moment? And maybe while we're waiting for them to come in on the chat, I'd like to ask a couple of broad questions if I can. Because I was interested, so you have this opposition between Hong Kong industries and all these different things that Hong Kong industries produce and toys. And I was just thinking about like the specificity, what is the specificity of toys as vectors of capitalism with this role of, I guess, infantilization or kind of theory of the cute, or kind of, are you kind of trying to excavate the dark side of toys, if you like, that there's something about toys that connote a kind of passivity or vulnerability, so that peddling toys is a kind of way of, keeping people childlike or in somewhat passive. Is that something that you're seeing at work in this, with this colonial framework, or is that sort of overreading things?
Yeah, I guess when Matthew Turner sort of argues that design industry is a kind of false consciousness of Hong Kong identity, right? I'm not sure whether it really applies to toys, right? I
Specifically,
mean,
right.
like specifically because, like, toys are not on the same league as, putting on a wig or, putting on your newfangled shoes to go out to the nightclub, right? I mean, it occupies a different kind of space. It's brought into the house, it's played by a child who has a very different interaction with it. I mean, you could talk about the specifics of the mechanics of the toy itself, right? Like how certain toys, like the plastic toy duck, I mean, it has no function other than to just like sit with you in the bathtub and maybe the child interacts with it. But the car sort of like, it's a way to think about velocity and sort of excitement to become a driver, or, to work in certain industries. And so that is the kind of forward-looking sentiment. But however, when you place toys within a kind of mise-en-scène of other industrial products, then maybe it takes on slightly different meanings. And I think that kind of complexity is what I'm trying to tease out. It's toys aren't, you can say that toys are just the dark side of modernity, right? I mean, Sai has a completely different interpretation of toys. She sort of domesticates it into an understanding of literary autonomy and literary fulfillment. And so I think that's how I would respond to your question.
Okay, great. Well, we've got lots and lots of questions coming in now, so I'll just read a couple of them. So this one's from Gina Marchetti. I'm fascinated by the photography of the boy playing with a train, trying hard to ignore the Shirley Temple doll and the horror film Santa Claus figure. And she's saying, is that Father Christmas on either side of him? You mentioned this as an image illustrating the fiction of the idealized family in Hong Kong. Could you say more about the origin and context of this photo? It seems to capture the ambivalence at the heart of modernity. Trains, for example, trapped between Hollywood and British colonialism. How is the image originally used? So maybe we could pull it up. Is that, or?
Yes, I could do that. Just wait a moment.
Because it is a really striking picture. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, of the provenance of this photo, I mean, I wasn't able to find any caption to this, but I've seen it circulated on, I think, the Hong Kong Memory website. And I don't know if someone in the audience really knows, has encountered and used this photograph before. But I know that there were colonial film documentaries which sort of depicted aspirational ideas of what a Hong Kong family ought to look like. And then you have, I guess, the governor coming in to visit a family, and that sort of dovetails into a narrative of how children are playing toys and adults also having adult toys, which, like the fridge and having the new wardrobe or whatever. I guess the point is that these aspirational ideals sort of inform how the general populace would go on to view themselves, right? Even though they were not part of this family. I mean, Hong Kong, a lot of them will go on to want to buy these products, and sort of the fiction sort of becomes the reality. And on the other hand, you have documentation of real Hong Kong life that sort of seems staid or like fake in contrast.
So another question, Dylan would like you to expand a little bit on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
No, that's not my real question. I'm typing up another question.
Go ahead, Dylan, jump in.
So I just wanted you to, that was just a little leitmotif that maybe I want you to think about in the future, because it's an amazing story, and also because that was my childhood. But since I'm on camera already, I'll just, two questions. One is, it feels like you're putting together two ways that seem different to me of relating to these objects, manufacturing and consumption. And I'd like you to, if you could explore more how those two really connect. Are they distinct, or are they really kind of the same mode? And the second is, I was wondering if you could talk more about the historical moment of kitsch, right? And that's a word actually that's not in your presentation, which I found interesting. But thinking about the 1990s, right? And not only in Hong Kong, but in the US, the 1990s were this, you think of like vinyl furniture and sort of like John Waters aesthetic type things, and that seems to have changed. So I wonder what you think about this kitsch, I don't know, disappearing or at least changing. How has this kind of transformed over time? So those are my questions.
Well, this is a very difficult question. I don't think I'm fully equipped to answer them now. Only because my sort of archival and reading materials so far have mainly concerned what the Hong Kong Industries website has put out, their formal faces of button-up ideas of what a toy should look like, what a toy has the perfect molding, and then when it's sent to the US, should look like. So the idea of kitsch hasn't, I haven't thought about it, but I really want to think more about it. So thank you for that.
So we have a question from Liz Lacouture. She says, very interesting presentation. I wonder if you plan to historicize this more, and if that could break you out of the London-Beijing dichotomy. And for example, what about the US and the Vietnam War?
Right, so the Vietnam War, I talked about G.I. Joes, and I mean, we could start with the Korean War and how basically there was an embargo on Chinese imports and exports, but I don't think that affected industries and toy manufacturing, and so they were able to sort of thrive under this quite laissez-faire economic environment to produce toys. And so I think an important part of the story would be Japan, actually, how Japanese models of industries and manufacturing were directly sort of absorbed by Hong Kong, maybe by the US. And so after, because of the way capital is outsourced, and because of the cheap labor in Hong Kong, that very soon after the toy manufacturing industry in Hong Kong thrived, and then the one in Japan failed. And I think, going back to Dylan's ideas of like, I guess the Ninja Turtles and G.I. Joes and things that were, there are a lot of toy products like guns and things that, promote machismo and like, the American imperialism, basically, in this key figure of the toy. I mean, you could say it's one part of the story, right? That children are being taught over Christmas when they open up their Christmas gift to like, desire certain kinds of action that they might not know of. And I think there's this really great Netflix documentary about toys and Ninja Turtles, but I don't remember the name right now. And it captures this moment in the Hal Ashby documentary where someone was like, why do we want to give children these toys for Christmas when it promotes such violence and unthinkingness about suffering and imperialism around the world?
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, because there's been a drive in toy manufacturing or in certain, the arrangement of toy stores to de-gender toys, right? To create toys that aren't, girl children play with dolls and learn how to be mothers, boy children play with soldiers and learn how to, make war. Is that something that you see at work in your Hong Kong examples in the 60s and 70s, or is it still very, very gendered in terms of the kind of toys that are being produced and manufactured and dispersed?
That's a good question. I don't know. Off the top of my head, like the kinds of toys I grew up playing in Malaysia, will not be the Barbie or will not be the cooking set, right? That I want to play. But there were like Power Rangers that were earmarked for the boys to play. And so I feel like maybe the same situation was happening in Hong Kong. If I know the kinds of Hong Kong Southeast Asian circulations and advertisements and ideas of masculinity consumption were also at play. So my guess is it's because of the kind of economic stability and the cultural conservatism that was happening in certain families, the kind of gender
It's quite strict.
is pretty straightforward.
Okay. And I guess I'll ask another question, because I was interested, obviously you bring up Sai Sai and the Teddy Bear Chronicles, and obviously she's unusual because she is both a toy maker and a writer, right? A kind of creates works, literary works, and physical objects. In the Teddy Bear Chronicles, she obviously labors for a long time to create these bears herself, right? Down to the minutest little details and the fabrics and the crafting. But in Hong Kong as a whole, is there this same valorization of the small scale, the handmade, the locally sourced material, the craftedness of a made in Hong Kong object? Is that something that emerges? Like, when was that sort of consciousness emerge? Because we see it now, obviously. You can, you go to craftsmen's little boutique shops and it's very much, we hand make this here, and we'll tell you about this, where we, get the tin from or whatever. And is that something that you see emerging as like an emergent consciousness of locally made, locally sourced, handcrafted things, or not so much?
Yeah, the question of like the distinction between the artisanal craftsmanship versus the sort of local workshop kind of craftsmanship is an interesting one to pursue. I don't really know, except to maybe speculate and say it's probably around the time of the decline of the Hong Kong toy industry that there were other avenues, and there's an opening of a market or a space or materials for writers to, of artists to explore. But I mean, but then that's to say that because it's the industry sort of crowds out creative inspiration. It's not true, right? You can just pick up something and make a toy for yourself, but maybe that whole history of private design has not been fleshed out, probably. But I sort of think it's also tied to histories of protests in Hong Kong, right? Or the kinds of objects of demonstration that people create, writing characters on a flag, or like making fun objects that sort of indexes an argument without spelling it out. And so these objects are also somewhat like toys, right? So you can maybe date it back to the riots in '67 and sort of curate a whole collection of Hong Kong objects around the theme of protests, demonstration, and maybe work through the way there.
So we have another question here from Gina, and I was just thinking about this too. She's asking about environmentalism and the story of, and how that works with the story of plastic toys in Hong Kong. Because I watched a documentary, a really shocking documentary, a while back about an ethnic minority family in mainland China whose job was to melt down plastics, right, and to sort plastics, and the sheer volume and the poison and the how the people at the very bottom of the social scale are put to work in this really horrible industry, kind and the toxins that are released into rivers, pollutants, et cetera, et cetera. And so Gina is asking whether this critique of the use of plastics in manufacturing would be part of your analysis of the treatment of childhood, like the environmental aspects. And I guess this comes in as well into kind of the materiality of the toys, or if they're made out of wood versus plastic, that kind of ethical, I suppose, like, is there an ethical dimension to this project?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. Thank you, Gina and Beth. I really want to pursue this angle. Not so much in terms of environmentalism, but when they manufactured toys using tin plates, there was the concept of tin rusting and cutting children and emitting certain kinds of dangers to people who use them, and so they innovated and came up with plastics, ironically, right, as a way to save lives. And so that environmentalism came into play, but yeah, I would like to think more about how not just the materiality and function and how it's being embodied by the child playing with the object, but also how I guess toy makers consciously think about microplastics and recycling and just creating more green designs in general, and whether that sort of seeps into the consciousness of writers, because after all, I think my project is a literary project about writing and thinking about genre, about the porousness of genre and experimentalism, and how materiality shapes the way we write and think. And yeah, so I think it's a larger story to tell, but I really want to center writers and texts in this project.
Yeah, great. And we just got a note. So I think the documentary is called Plastic China by Wong from 2017. So people should check that out. It's a shocking watch, but it's important to sort of remember the scale of plastic production, right? And obviously not just toys, but how plastic is used in so many different things, and how it pollutes the earth. And just linking to this environmental question, because I was thinking about Zhuangzi, right, in your last few slides. And there was this really nice quotation, right? Humans are not the only way of defining other living beings. And just thinking about, I don't know whether it might be useful to your project to engage theorists of new materialism or thing theory, right? Thinkers like Jane Bennett, Stacey Alamo, who are very interested in kind of thinking about matter as agential, right? Vibrant matter, I think that's Jane Bennett's coinage, and thinking about how these larger structures of agency and vibrancy between humans and non-human things work. And I think it's interesting too, because this also ties in very nicely, even though it's a sort of Western European theory as such, new materialism, but it's very, very similar to Chinese metaphysics, with the idea of the 10,000 things is this harmonious, interconnected network in which human beings are not necessarily, ahead of or top of the hierarchy. So it might be useful if you're thinking about materialism specifically to look at some of these thinkers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I haven't really touched the whole new thinking critical theory about new materialism yet, because I think I'm still coming from the angle of labor and sci-fi's engagement with craft and writing, and so I think.
You're already doing so many things because you're sort of doing the archival kind of social cultural history as well, right? So this kind of archival stuff, objects and people and literature. So it's a kind of a lot to take on. And I guess because you're looking at hyper contemporary text too, right? Because the last novel was from 2020, is that right? Mm-hmm. So I wonder, is it possible to interview some of these writers? Is that something that you have thought about, like being in Hong Kong? Does that kind of play a part in your research? Have you tried? Could you get an interview with Sai? That would be amazing, and then you could let us all know how it went.
Yeah, I could probably write to Sai or telephone her, and I don't know, but it is possible, and I've interviewed people before, but not really for literature. So I think that's an interesting thought. I generally like to read someone's writing, and for such a public person like Sai, I think whatever she says and things or like views is already on paper, and so I wouldn't want to disturb her presence just for me to answer a question, right? And the fact that we are celebrating her book, and there's so many events culturally around the city just to talk about Sai's works, and I think there are definitely people who view Sai's works as sort of constructing a local identity, and people who view Sai's works as some kind of another text in world literature, right? As presenting a way to think about new materialisms, for example. And so these two approaches are not necessarily in contrast with one another. And I mean, Sai could tell me what she's reading. She loves science fiction. She loves playing soccer. She loves making toys and things like that. It's all in public database that allows me to really create an image of the writer.
Okay, great. We have a question come in from Alvi Wong. He says, obviously really wonderful talk. I very much enjoy your reading of toys as a metaphor, commodity and material objects that embody both the success of Hong Kong modernity and its contradictions with class and gender, etc. In terms of gender, I feel that the film Mambo Girl from 1957 might fit in this project somehow, if you know that film. The orphan girl herself is a kind of plaything or object of attention, and the film references the doll throughout. And he thinks that the family in the film actually owns a toy shop.
Great, thanks, Alvin. Definitely want to pursue that reference because anything with a toy shop finds a way into the paper somehow. Yeah, and I guess it's interesting to think about the contradictions of Hong Kong modernity from the angle of toys, right? And so I'll look forward to maybe talking more with you, Alvin, about this movie.
Do we have any other questions or? If not, I guess we could leave it there. Unless Nick, you want to talk?
Actually, I have a question.
Okay, great. And Julie, go ahead.
Hi, Nick.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it very much. You said in at some part of the talk, you mentioned a certain melancholy around the fall of the toy industry in Hong Kong. And on the one hand, you said, of course, the toy kind of is a figure for a certain kind of anti-democratic, a kind of anti-democratic turn, right? But it as well as a kind of figure for capitalist accumulation, except that in the kind of loss of a kind of large scale production of the toy in Hong Kong, there seems to be a certain kind of melancholy that gets deposited across literary works through the figure of the toy. And somehow it occupies a space that is neither, correct me if I'm wrong, but neither democratic, anti-democratic, nor simply capitalist accumulation. That it comes to stand for something else. And what I gathered from your talk is that something else keeps shifting and changing in the literary works, but it all kind of has a link to a certain kind of loss of something. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about this relationship to that, to the melancholic part of it that gets represented in the literary works itself, and what forms that takes.
Yeah, I guess my first instinct would be go to psychoanalysis and ideas of object relations theory, and think about the toy like the mother's breast as something that you can encounter but also dissociate from and sort of form your identity, and whether the child is melancholic or simply growing up is one way to put it. And I think you put it so beautifully that the literary writings about the sense of melancholia that might not register anti-capitalism or anti-democracy, but sort of sits in this weird space that's consciously shifting in its tone. And so I think one way to think about that is through aesthetic theory. And I like Xiangai's work about cute objects. I mean, she writes about I Love Lucy and the kind of factory line production of objects, right? And the kind of zany attitude in terms of the labor that gets generated, but also when the timing is off, you know, what the humor comes out. And I think maybe that's one way to think about that in literature itself, right? That the kind of uncanny or like unpredictable aspects of labor, when the timing is off, what happens. But my sense in going to this literature is that I haven't found humorous works or like literature that deals with, that can be defined as the genre of tragedy or genre of comedy or in Hong Kong, because whenever I encountered a toy or like a child in 60s and 70s Hong Kong journals, they're often talked about a material object that is consumed by the child, that the parents have to pay something to get that. The child is crying in the shopping mall. He's a bad boy. He does not know confusion, civilization, whatever. Yeah. And so I get a bit annoyed with that. And that's as I jump to the later works to sort of retrieve a kind of imaginative materialism that looks back with a sense of melancholia, but not registering whatever I described in the first 30 minutes of the talk. But thank you very much for the question.
Okay, no, that was clarifying. Thank you so much.
And Gina's just mentioned in the chat here, Ran Ling Yu's film Little Toys from 1933. I don't know if that's a film that you're aware of, Nick, or Gina, if you want to say anything about it, or no? Is that something that you've heard of, Nick, or not?
Not this specific movie, but definitely important to talk about modernity, gender, and spectatorship.
Yeah, I was just thinking, just to kind of a follow-up on kind of the post-war era here in Hong Kong, where so many people would still remember the Shanghai Republican period. And this is a film about toy manufacturing in a small village with a woman who her daughter ends up becoming a toy designer in Shanghai. And I think that the close connection, both physically, because a lot of the manufacturers that settled here in Hong Kong were from Shanghai. A lot of the designs came from Shanghai. But also kind of imaginatively, I think people would remember that era. And it seems like that sense of melancholy that Anjali was talking about, I think overshadows both that film. This film is set during the Japanese occupation, set at a time when the Japanese were threatening Shanghai and threatening China and making some inroads and during the warlord period. So I think a lot of people would remember that period in relationship to films like this one, and also relationship to, you know, the irony of the melancholy in relationship to the joys supposedly of childhood. Just a thought.
Thank you so much.
I loved your talk too.
Thank you.
Any final questions or comments for Nick? If not, I guess we'll conclude today there. Thank you so much, Nick, for such a fascinating talk. And I think, is there a, right, so if anybody would like updates on the Center for, sorry, I'm forgetting what this is called, globalization, the Center for the Study of Globalization and Cultures, you can check out the website on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. But we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Nick.
Thank you so much for listening. And I'd love to continue the conversation if we run into each other. Love to hear your thoughts about this. Thank you. Bye.